Dr. King was a minister, but we often don't think about the relationship between theology and radical politics, radical organizing, and even the broader role of religious institutions in the church in this radical freedom movement. And so I said, who are the 3 smartest people that I could find that could make this thing happen? And again, they all said yes. So I couldn't be happier than to announce these 3 amazing people. The first person that I'm going to announce is a brilliant scholar. She wrote a wonderful book called Jezebel Unhinged. She is the founder of Feminist Wire. My brain froze for a second. Just a brilliant scholar, brilliant thinker, brilliant public intellectual. And I'm grateful that she was willing to come here to help us talk and think about these issues. Can we please give a round of applause for Tamura Lomax? This brother he's got so many jobs. He's had so many jobs. He's been a university president. He's been the pastor of a church, which is a whole other kind of job. He's a brilliant thinker. He's been a faculty member. In fact, he's a professor emeritus from the New York Seminary. He's also on the faculty at Columbia University right now. He's written several books. My favorite of his is The Politics of Jesus.
Yes.
That book honestly radically changed the way I understood scripture, text, and really what the political work of the church was. In the same way that Dr. Lomax's work helped me think about the trope of Jezebel and how that helps us think about not just pop culture but black scripture. Obery Hendricks made me reimagine Jesus as a revolutionary.
Yes.
And that work is so important, so critical, so powerful, and he's a truth teller he doesn't suffer fools. And I appreciate that about him in a moment when so many people go along and get along. He's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant brother and a courageous brother. Can we give a round of applause to our brother, Dr. Obery Hendricks? Now, I could have had Brittney Cooper on every one of these panels. And I really was going to ask her to be on every one of these panels, but I knew she wasn't going to say yes to that because she got good sense. But Brittney Cooper is someone who has thought so widely and so deeply about a wide range of issues. And I said, how interesting would it be to have someone who has written brilliantly on gender, brilliantly on politics. Thinking her wonderful book, Beyond Respectability, is a powerful book. Eloquent Rage is a powerful book. She's written 2 books, edited another one, got more coming. A brilliant scholar, but also someone with deep roots in the church and someone who has been willing to use her powerful voice to be courageous and critical of the black church at the same time that she affirms her religious faith. She is, again, a dear friend and a powerful, powerful, powerful critic. I'm happy to have her here, and I'm happy for her to be on this particular panel. Give a round of applause to Dr. Brittney Cooper. So we gonna just get this thing going. I think about, we talk about Dr. King all the time. We always say Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We understand him as a pastor. That's part of his public biography. I think what we know less about and what we talk and think less about is the role of religion, the role of scripture, the role of the church in his political formation and how it enhances his politics, how it maybe constrains his politics, how it undermines his politics. So I want to spend some time, first of all, I'd like to spend some time thinking about Dr. King and the role that the church plays in his formation. Whoever wants to start can.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you, first of all. It's interesting that this is not typically a pivotal part of the discourse in Dr. King and even social movement. We cannot understand Dr. King or social movement in America and not understanding its relationship to the Black church and the Black church's relationship to Black theology and the relationship to God. And so to even get at King, to understand how we get a king, how we get an elevator, how we get, these movement leaders, we have to understand their spirituality. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, I think it's Over 79% of African Americans or Black folks in America are still Christian. And of that number, over 50% are part of the Black church. And so we don't talk about this, but the Black church has a very particular and very large hold on Black folks and how we understand ourselves. And so King, at a very young age, he had a very high, I don't want to say Christology, but a very high a strong relationship with God. He's part of the Black church. His father was a pastor. His father was a biblical fundamentalist. King later became not so much a fundamentalist, but he became a biblical liberalist. But King's idea of personalism, this idea of self and somebodiness, that's deeply rooted in his theological purview, is that we are somebody, right? That is rooted in his idea of being imago Dei. So his idea that we are made in the image of God, regardless of how we're being treated in society, we are just as good as someone else. And so getting at King, we have to really, and social movement, we have to really understand how he locates himself in the Black church and how the Black church was pivotal to him understanding that regardless of how white supremacy is at work in his very young age, it was the Black church that said, no, you are somebody, no, you are important. It was the Black preacher who said, you know, you are born with inherent dignity and worth. And so that's central to King's ideology, but also his ideology, political ideology and theology are deeply intertwined in the Black church in terms of how the Black church helped him to come to see that he himself, but also all Black people, are worthy. They're worthy of respect. They're worthy of love. They are sites of love. They're worthy of justice. So the Black church is very central to this movement, but specifically to King and how he understood the movement and how he understood himself.
I look at King in some different ways, not different from Dr. Lomax, but different from mainstream discourse, and that King is heir to an intellectual tradition of Black Christian socialists from the beginning of the 20th century, who saw, and correctly I think, they saw a lot of congruences between democratic socialism and the biblical narratives of justice. King, when you look at King, well, first off, justice, the word justice is the most often used word in the Bible. Preachers don't talk about that, but that is the most often used word in the Bible. King understood that. King also understood that the message that resonates among the people is the ethical message. So he talked about justice. He talked about social righteousness. He didn't get into this, you need to be saved and you need to believe this, that, and the other. Because when you read Jesus in the Gospels, he almost said nothing about what you should believe. He said how you should act. So King, that was central for King. As far as the Black church being formative for him, it was very importantly informative for him. His father actually was a sort of, well, I wouldn't say not a liberation preacher. He was a fundamentalist in some ways, but he also talked about economic democracy. He talked about, he also often quoted from Luke 4 that says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And, some of his Baptist colleagues in Atlanta, they didn't want to hear that. But he pushed that. And he used to take Martin, this was during the Depression, he used to take Martin to the soup lines to see the people who were suffering and the people who were hungry. And he sensitized in that way. The other thing is that the son of a Black, well, not just the son of a Black Christian, but Black folks, and I don't know what's like these days, but when I was coming up, generations before, folk made young people feel confident. And as you were saying, and he took that confidence into the public sphere. He took that sense of love in the public sphere because he was ensconced in that church all of the time. And I think all of those things came together to make him who he is. But we can never forget that for King, the biblical ethics of justice and righteousness and truth what really forged him, what really moved him. And I'll just say this. Many of you know the story. During the Montgomery bus boycott, King got all kinds of hate calls all day long. He couldn't take the phone off the hook because it might have been somebody calling from a movement who needed something. So all day long. One particular evening, he got a call that had such hatred in the caller's voice that it just chilled him to the bone, and it broke him down. And he went in the kitchen, poured some coffee, and put his head down and said, "Lord, I can't take this anymore. Please, show me how I can quit without looking like a coward, how I can throw off the mantle of leadership without looking like a coward and demoralizing the people." And he said he heard a voice that said, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness," righteousness meaning doing right in society. "Stand up for justice and stand up for truth." And when you look at Martin's career, those ethics run through everything he said and did in the public sphere. So I say that to say what we must focus on in church, I think more than just a Jesus personality cult, is focus on the basic biblical ethics that have freed so many people, has fueled so many liberation movements, and fueled black folks making it through as well. Because when you look at the spirituals were about justice. We're going to get justice. We're going to get free one day. Now, gospel music is talking about something different now. Leave it to Jesus. You know, we can't do it. Leave it to Jesus. Spiritual said, "No, Lord's going to get you for what you're doing to me." That's the title of the song. But we're gonna someday be to the promised land. They talked about the Exodus. Gospel music is a whole nother genre. It focuses on the person of Jesus more than anything else. And I've written about that. So I better leave it alone because I'll talk about it too much. I'll stop there.
No, we're gonna get to all of it. Brittney, yes.
So, despite what Marc said, I'm not a theologian. Yeah, it's all. Despite what Marc said, I'm not a theologian. I'm not. I am a churchgoer. I am a committed Christian. I am the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and I'm from the Deep South. So those are my entry points into a conversation like this. So certainly, part of why I think King matters is because in many ways, part of both the legacy and I think the loss of the last 50 years is that King became people's archetypal model. I mean, along with like his favorite preacher, who was Gardner Taylor, who I was privileged to get to hear preach, of what preaching ought to sound like, what preaching ought to look like in the black church, how preaching ought to make you feel. And the thing that I think about growing up as a person in the Baptist church in the Deep South, which is not the same as the Southern Baptist church, right? Because we get those things mixed up. I mean, there are different conventions and it matters. So growing up, hearing, my dad is a very well-respected, Baptist preacher in my, home community who can do all of the traditional things that you think about when you think about preachers. And then he is my stepfather, but has been in my life for most of my life. And so he helped raise a daughter who is hella opinionated and, and deeply skeptical of lots of orthodoxy. And I didn't hear a woman preach till I was in college. And then I still didn't even at that time. And that woman was Dr. Renita Weems, and she's one of the nation's best preachers, right? And still I was like, I just don't know about women in the pastorate. So I'm saying that to say that some of how I think about King is about the way that I have grown up watching young men who want to have some kind of value to the community see him as a model for what it, particularly in the church, for what it looks like to lead people. right? That they are very enamored, as the last panel talked about, with that kind of charisma. They are very enamored with the way that preaching is supposed to sound like that. And so I wonder both about how we retain the legacy of a king and also how we sit with the complications that it provides. One of the things I did just in thinking about this panel, I've written a bit about King in my book, Eloquent Rage. But also, you know, I like, as we were saying, the late king, the radical king. I find him particularly inspiring. Part of the reason that, one of the things I wonder about is, as a person who is a committed churchgoer, and I've gone to all kinds of churches over the course of my life, conservative Baptist churches, I go to Progressive Baptist Church in Philly now, St. Paul's Baptist.
Dr. Leslie Callahan.
Right. But one of the things that I think a lot about is, and I've also, you know, I went to grad school in Atlanta, so I was part of a Baptist mega church there. And that's a particular thing. King was so deeply erudite and political in his preaching for everyday regular black folks. He went to church, he would give you a history lesson, he would talk to you about war, he would talk to you about the ethical problems with us engaging, for instance, in war. He would talk to us about our responsibility to the poor. And the thing that I'm trying to understand is why we have gotten to a point in the church today where what we feel like is that our people don't come to church for a political message, right? They don't come to church to get the history lesson, to have the benefit of that training politicize them. I'm trying to think about why it is the case. See, we do a thing that is quite neoliberal, where we romanticize Jesus, where we make Jesus outsized in our calculations of how we ought to live, even though for me, certainly Jesus is a core part of my own faith. But we also spend a lot of time in church, it's about self-regulation. And the reason I'm asking about this is because going to St. Paul's and seeing the small but committed crowd of folks who come every day, and then thinking about mega churches where people are going to them by the thousands every day and giving all this money, but they're not getting political messages, they're getting messages about your purpose and empowerment, and God has a plan for your life, and no weapon formed against you will prosper. But you don't see that kind of attendance at the churches that are like, are we fighting for the people? What about white supremacy? What about the fact that Jesus was challenging the Roman Empire? So what do you do? So where did we go wrong in the last 50 years where we began to think that the way to help black people was to give them a message that is so focused on reforming themselves that they don't then have to see any divine responsibility to the people, right? That is the thing that I think we have done wrong with King's legacy. What I see when I look at his sermons, when I read his work, is that he had a deep respect for people and for their dignity, and felt that what it meant to respect people's dignity wasn't to preach at them about sin, wasn't to preach at them about who they were sleeping with. I mean, no, look, that's because he was sleeping with lots of people, right? And so, you know, so he wasn't preaching at people about who you're sleeping with and what, and did you think a bad thought about somebody, and did you say a cuss word, and did you have a beer last night, and were you at the juke joint? He wasn't doing that. He was saying we're in a fight for our lives, and that means that we have to keep our clear sense of who the power structures are, and our commitment is around creating a world where love is the radical revolution, right? That is very close to how I understand Jesus' message. And so when you see our folks going and knocking down churches by the droves, well, that ain't the message they're getting. They're being beat down by the idea that the reason that they are being harmed by systems of oppression is because of personal sin. That is the thing that makes me sad. And that is the conversation that I think we need to be having about the church. And that is the way that I think we honor the radical legacy of King, is by getting back to cultivating our folks to be people who understand the church is engaged in a different project than regulating personal behavior. It's just so limited.
Okay, sorry about that. I wanted to respond to that and kind of add to it, because I've been thinking about that shift too. One of the things I wanted to say is that King was an outlier in his time, though. So we have this radical message from King where he's talking about poverty, he's talking about rights, he's talking about justice, he's talking about this love that is so radical that it looks like justice when it's enacted in person. He's talking about these things. He's talking about marching, he's talking about the courts, he's talking about voting, he's talking about civil disobedience, and many black preachers, black male preachers in particular, they were not about that life. So we see that now. We see. So there is a particular shift that I want to name, but I also want to say that most people were not like King in his day, right? But then there were many who were part of the movement. Eventually, folks started, coming on, but many, they saw him as a troublemaker and as a problem. And I think that we see that now, where when you do have preachers who have a radical voice, if you think about Jeremiah Wright, right, they become seen as a troublemaker, and we have to say, well, what happened? And I think part of it is something happened in the 80s and 90s where the black church, the black preacher, you have the move of prosperity gospel, but that's also connected to this rise of the middle class. And of course there's still disparity, but there's this rise of the black middle class, and so that lets folks know that we're okay. So we don't need to struggle as much anymore. We don't need that message. That's the old, even Michelle Obama writes that. Like, that's the old message, right? Not that it's a current message that we need to have. And so even now you have someone like Jeremiah Wright who's seen as an outlier, and we want the prosperity message. Well, the prosperity message makes us feel good. It makes us feel like there's something we can change. These systems and structures, we can't change all that, so it's stressful to our people. And so people are making a choice to go with what feels good or go where the work lies. And sometimes, we're pressed on every side. And so folks decide to go with what feels good, what's popular.
What I'm starting to hear from y'all is almost like a genealogy of the church in terms of its political shifts. Could y'all help us understand a little bit more where that happens? Because I'm hearing there's a shift toward the prosperity gospel and toward the kind of mega church thing now. And there's this way that I'm hearing King is framed as an outlier to a somewhat conservative church. But that could lead us to believe the church has been largely conservative up to the 60s, when in fact there's a much more interesting, I think, and complicated history of the church in terms of its role in radical politics before we get to a king. So if y'all can help us talk about that just a little bit so people can really understand how dynamic the church has been in terms of its politics.
Well, that's very important.
The rest of popular fiction, and that is that the black church has always been at the forefront of black liberation. There have been a few, but they've never really been the forefront. It's not just the black church, it's Christian church, period. For a few reasons. Before I get to that, let me just say this. Martin Luther King, when he was trying to drum up support for the Poor People's Campaign, he called a meeting in Virginia. He invited over 100 preachers, I think 103 preachers. Anyone know how many showed up? Anyone say 0?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so that gives us some sense. And so when I hear that, well, preachers have always been the forefront. No, that's just not the truth. Some have. But there's an historical narrative we have to look at real quick, and I talked about much. Jesus was executed as a political, as a seditionist. Crucifixion was reserved for those who were seen as enemies of the empire. And so we had the faith of Jesus up until about the beginning, like the 4th century, like 313 or so. Emperor Constantine, it's a long story how he decided he was supposed to be a Christian. He believed God helped him win a war. In other words, God helped him kill more people than the other guy who was trying to be emperor, right? And so, which is ridiculous. But anyway, he made Christianity legitimate. And at that point, the religion of the faith of the oppressed became the religion of the oppressor. Okay, Rome killed Jesus, and then Rome ends up the emperor of the same empire. He declares himself the 13th apostle appointed to God by God, and he sponsors all these councils where they came up with a number of things that we still believe in now, doctrines like the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, which was a doctrine that's not really well biblically based, and other things that run our lives by now. But the interesting thing, the important thing is that he was Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest priest of the Roman Empire. He became the chief priest of Christianity. And since that time, mainstream Christianity has always been aligned with the powers that be. And that is irrefutable. So when we talk about the black church, the genealogy of the black church, there are other things we have to think about also, and that has to do with capitalism, but also with integration. Churches had a much stronger and clearer mandate what to do in our communities when our struggle was much clearer. And after the period of integration, black communities, became more diverse. People were able to move around and do other kinds of things and get into industries and positions than never before. And the church did not seem to have the same kind of push to fight for justice. But a lot of that had to do with that integration was seen as the goal of justice by so many people. And so when we're integrated, folks started falling off. Then when we fell off, we fell into the lap of capitalism because it opened the door for us. And so the churches became concerned about quantity and not quality. Congregations became audiences. It was about how many people you could attract and that kind of thing. And then Martin Luther King was sort of a bad model, a fortunate model in this sense, because he was on TV all the time, and he was Reverend Doctor. A lot of people started saying, well, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be in the limelight, and you have people who didn't graduate from high school call themselves doctor, to be like King. And then, that's why everybody's a bishop these days, because we got all this kind of foolishness going on. See, so these are the kinds of things that we have to deal with in the church. A lot of preachers are following bogus models of ministry, and they're not really taught that our goal is not to change how people feel, but change the world, to change the society. And the kingdom of God is relational. It's not in the pie in the sky. And so that's part of our. So what we're talking about is we have to really. King said a revolution of values. We need a revolution of values of what it is we value. Do we value justice or do we value just us?
I just want to make a really quick point. When talking about the genealogy, I don't want to skip over. When I think of the black church, I think of the plantation and I think of the ancestors on the plantation, and that was radical space. And so when we talk about the radicality of the black church, we have to see that it's gone and there's been moves of ebbs and flows because of what's been mentioned up here, capitalism, civil rights movements, folks getting rights. But the only institution to exit out of black institution to exit out of slavery is the black church, right? So you have the hush harbors, you have folks getting together in the bushes and talking about not only religion, but talking about justice. It was the Bible. Their very radical reading of the Bible, and that's what still pushes us forward. That still ran through King's theology. That still lives today. We see it in the theology of Jeremiah Wright and other James Cone and others, right? So womanist theologians. That theology still lives where, for them, politics, the politics of being free and being black being beautiful, right? And then being made in the images of God, those things have always been entwined on the plantation. That doesn't mean that the black church has always lived out this kind of radical theology, but the radical theology was there. And so I just didn't want to go from Constantine and then to King and then skip over the formation.
Slavery thing.
Yeah, it happened on the plantation.
Yes. Part of what I think that we have to do, because look, I'm a radical black feminist, I got a PhD, and one of the things that was hard for me when I was getting my PhD was, you go to grad school, everybody gets woke and you feel like you can't be a believer anymore, you know what I mean? And so what I want to hold is the tension between saying, no, like, I'm still a little Baptist girl, black Baptist girl from the deep South, and I'm all the other things too. I I want us to be able to hold those kinds of spaces when we think about our radical potential, when we think about radical politics, when we think about radical organizing. One of my biggest critiques of being, part of, like, as a Black feminist activist and scholar, is that we'll leave behind a whole generation of Black women because we won't grapple with the church and what it means, and because we think that folks are politically retrograde and theologically retrograde because they still believe in Jesus, not understanding that sometimes what we are really saying to you is that we believe in Jesus so that we don't kill white people. Right? Real talk, like, y'all know y'all want to go snatch people, and I'm not saying that God should shear us of our teeth around critiquing injustice, but I am saying that to the extent that we have to exist in the world with people who don't mean us well, having a spiritual compass about what are we here for, what is our long game, who sustains us, what is our own sense of purpose, where do we find joy, those are all lessons that I learned coming up in the church so that I wouldn't be derailed by the racist stuff that I was dealing with as a young person coming up in the Deep South. So I would say that. I also think, so there's this cool story. So King helped in the early 1960s, 1961, the National Baptist Convention is the biggest convention of Black Baptist church members. I'm a National Baptist Convention baby. And so King and others were mad with the National Baptist Convention because they were not on board with this civil rights message. And so, there's a convention in 1961 that apparently devolves into a fist fight, a very long fist fight, but over this battle about whether the NBC will take political stances. And so later yes, and a minister dies because so they come to fisticuffs and people die over this battle about what will the church be. And so King and Gardner Taylor and other ministers get together in 1961 and they form today what still exists today, the Progressive National Baptist Convention. That's 61. I'm also reminded, though, that in 1963, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation research and thinking about the March on Washington, I read this 1964 book by a woman named Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who's from New York and was an important political figure in New York in the 1940s and 50s. And she is the only woman on the organizing committee for the March on Washington. And so she writes about sitting at the March on Washington, and she writes about that moment that we all remember when King says, "I have a dream." And she says, "I so wish he had said, we have a dream."
Okay.
Because he was part of a tradition of folks who had been struggling for freedom. King's dream wasn't his singular Black male dream.
Right.
It was the dream of a whole community of folks who, as Imani Perry reminded us on the first panel, chose him, picked him, and essentially positioned him for national leadership in particular ways. And so even that simple shift, it's interesting that you see the woman in the mix who has the critique about how he needs to be communal and inclusive, right? So in 1961, they brawling because, they want a progressive convention that is political, and the Progressive National Baptist Convention ordains women in the or supports churches that ordain women in the Baptist church. And then 2 years later, you see him still getting it wrong. Still not getting right that women have put him in this position, that women are at the forefront of leadership. They don't let women speak at the March on Washington. They let one woman sing, but they don't let women talk, right? And so I think we have to be able to tell the truth about the fact that King is a complicated man who both gets it right and also gets it wrong. But what I also love is recognizing part of the thing that inspires me about that story of them coming to fisticuffs at the church convention is that we have the responsibility, and it is part of our intellectual and political and theological tradition, to struggle for the church that we want, to struggle for the religious institutions that we want, to duke it out. And no, we don't have to fight and kill people. I mean, the church should stop killing people theologically, it should stop. But it means that that part of what we are charged to do is to fight. And if the church doesn't do what we want it to do, we also can leave, right? We can create other institutions. We don't have to stay in oppressive systems that don't work theologically. And we see that. And unfortunately, churches don't give folks the agency. They don't affirm the agency. They don't teach these traditions. So we are so interested in talking about how everybody deals with each other in Christian love that we forget that any any version of the church that we have and any radical potential of the church that we have has come through struggle, has come through fighting, has come through death. And we need to think about that as being part of our tradition too.
You said people have the option of leaving. One of the dominant narratives, at least one of the narratives I hear circulating a lot, is that people have left. That this generation of young folk is gone from the church. That we're an increasingly secular society, and even the black folk that identify sort of on censuses and stuff like that as Christian don't actively practice in the same way. When we were in Ferguson in 2014, another conversation was, look, we're not in the church. We're outside. Obery's, of course, raised an interesting point in saying, we're overstating how much we were ever in the church as part of our political movement, but nonetheless, we seem increasingly less in the church. The preachers are not standing in front of us anymore. Some of them got shouted down when we were in Ferguson, like, look, we don't need y'all right now. We got something else going on. To what extent is the church, and the black church in particular, losing its centrality in our radical freedom movement? To what extent should it? And how do we make sense of that?
So I think it's complicated.
I think it's complicated. You're right, first of all. So I talked about the stats in that almost like 78% of African Americans are still Christian, 50 some odd is there in the black church. What I didn't say is that those are the numbers, those are the general numbers, but when you break it down by age, you're right, in that those who are still in the church to make up those numbers are pretty much those who are like 35 and over. So the 16, those who don't have to, they don't have to go to church anymore because mom and daddy said you have to go to church, right? So that age to like 34, that number is dwindling fast. And so you have a lot of folks now who are raising questions. You have some churches combining. You have, but a lot of churches and pastors asking the question, what can we do to not lose our hold? Because there is a shifting. There's a shifting of the ground. There is an issue of relevance. There's an issue of belief and hope. And so one of the things, I'm the daughter of a pastor. My father's a pastor, Black Baptist pastor and theologian. I'm the wife of a pastor. So I'm a black feminist, a radical black feminist, and a first lady, right? And so, I'm very much those things. And so, one of the things that I talk about in my work, and specifically my newest work on Jezebel, is what the church really needs to do is it has to, in order to connect with the younger generations. It's not about building a coffee house in your, maybe, right, but not really. It's not about building a coffee house in your church or the pastor, trying to dress like the teenagers so that he can or she can seem cool. Or it's not about doing a twerk off in church as a part of praise dance. I mean, maybe, but I don't think it's that. I think we have to look at why folks have left. And I think a large part of why folks have left is what Dr. Cooper mentioned, and that is the church has alienated a huge body of people, not just because they're young, but because of our differences. And so the church is great on race, but it is horrible on sex, gender, sexuality, right? The black church is homophobic, it's trans antagonistic. So we do really, really good on race. And that was one of the things that I wanted to mention, because earlier we said about King and women and being central to the movement. That's not true. King was very sexist, and part of why he was sexist is because of the black church. And so we have to deal with this sexism and homophobia and this patriarchy that is very present and central in the black church that has ran our folks out, because younger generations, they don't have the kind of rigidity that we have in terms of what manhood is and what womanhood is, right? The younger generation is a lot more fluid, which is very beautiful because that's more like the ancestors. The ancestors were very fluid. Our folks on the plantation, they had to be. Right? They didn't have a choice. Women weren't seen as, black slave women didn't get to be ladies. Right? And the men, black slave men didn't get to be the man in the house. They didn't get to be a part of patriarchy. So they were a lot more fluid in terms of their gender identity, which is also connected also to their sexual identity. And so we have to look at why folks are leaving and why they feel isolated and why they don't feel welcome. And then we have to make our God bigger so that we can change our message and so that we can become more relevant. And I think that that's key. I don't think that it's doing some sort of popular, I don't know. But then though, there is this group. You have to look at, well, why did T.D. Jakes get so big? Why do the mega pastors get so big though? What is it about them? Because he's definitely not talking about sex, gender, inclusion. He's not talking about. So then, what is it about that? Well, what he does offer is he does something, and I critique him in my work. He does something that many pastors don't do, and that he tells black women, even though I think he's shady about it, he tells black women, I care. And the largest group of folks in the church are black women, right? And so he at least has the message that he cares. He wants to, you're gonna be all right. Now he tells you ain't shit at the end of that, but the first 80%, he's telling you he connects with you and that your story matters. So we really have to look at what is it about certain church houses that draw certain people in, but we also have to look at why folks have left. Why? And so that means we have to listen. And I think we have a hard time with listening to folks who are younger than us because we don't think that they have much to add.
Wow. All right, we get somewhere interesting. No, go ahead. Go.
Martin Luther King said, churches are not entertainment centers. Monkeys are for entertaining, not preachers. I think that's very timely because part of the problem is these churches have turned into entertainment. Uh-oh, the Lord's mad at me. A lot of these churches have turned into entertainment centers. And people come to be entertained, which raises the question of, really, what does it mean to be a Christian these days? And part of what it means is don't kill anybody, don't rob a bank, and come to church, and you're a Christian in good standing. And there's a lot behind that. Part of it is that it's more important. We talk about capitalism and quantitative. It's more important to get bodies in the church than it is really to teach them the real importance of what it means to be a disciple, what it means to be a struggle for freedom, what it means to say the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He's anointed me to preach good news and liberation to the oppressed. It is the lowest common denominator usually is offered now for what it means to be a Christian. And I have a church in mind in New York that's really got a lot of young people. And one way to get young people is through great music. And that takes me back to Kirk Franklin. He used to say, Kirk is calling people to the church. He's calling Jesus. Well, what is he calling them to? What kind of church is he calling them to? You listen to the songs, it almost has nothing to do with liberation of the people. And so this is...
The song's good, though. The song.
Oh, I love some of his songs. I enjoy some of his songs. But, of course, as a critical thinker, I have to listen to what he's saying, too. And what he's not saying. And, I'm not going to put the brother down. But, we can't... I guess what I'm saying is, he's seen as a standard by too many people. And the standard should be, think about if we use the passion of gospel music and wed it to a liberation sensibility. Think about what that would do to folk. If we could take the normative liberation sensibilities the pretty normative sensibilities of the spirituals that talked about liberation, that talked about Jesus, about God freeing the Hebrew boys from the fiery furnace, and Exodus and all that, and we put that together with the gospel music, people falling out and all that. Once I spoke at a church, this was years ago when I was real crazy. I'm just crazy now. And I was speaking at a church with a lot of young people. I just really started coming to the ministry. By the way, I've never been a pastor, thank the Lord, but I've spoken into a lot of churches. And I was hitting it, boy, hitting it. Because I grew up, help me Lord. I grew up a soldier in the Black Nationalist movement. So I had all that radicality. And I was hitting it. And some of these folk, they started shouting so hard, and some of the brothers were saying, let's do something. It scared me. But what I saw is that if we could move people to do that, if we were about that. But preachers want to move people to fall out or give more money than they can afford to give. And so the question comes down to, what does it mean to be a Christian, and what does it mean to be a church, and what is the mandate of the church today? And those definitions are not clear at all, and we're not pushing hard enough to get clear definitions. When corporate executives can make 300 and 400 times the average salary of the average worker, meaning that those workers have to work 300 or 400 years to make what a corporate executive makes in 1 year, and that's happening, and you don't hear a word from that in the church. 60 years after Martin Luther King was critiquing capitalism, we have a real problem. I am ordained in the AME Church. I'm a biblical scholar, that's my profession, a New Testament scholar. But the church, I will tell you, and I tell from the bottom of my heart, I got a problem with the church today. Because all the money, all the resources, all the time, all the bodies, every week we have, and look how little is being done. Jesus would not want, if the gospel, I read it right, he wouldn't want anything to do with most of these churches. And they wouldn't want him coming anyway, because he didn't, brother probably need a haircut and his feet would be dusty. They didn't use deodorant in them days. You know how people are. Amen.
So I want you all to be helping me think about, though, because I'm hearing a lot about what the church is not doing, and I think your analysis is right. I want to also leave here with somewhat of a vision of what a radical theology should look like. What does a radical theology look like? So at least keep that in the back of your head as you're answering these questions. Affirmatively, what should a radical theology include?
Thanks for that. So I want to say a couple of things. First, one of the biggest things that we've got to do in the church, and one of the reasons that the mega churches are prospering, is because they're tapping into the emotional lives of Black people.
Yes.
And we do run the risk, when all we do is talk up here about systems and structures, of not talking about what it feels like when your soul is being crushed. And so I do want to own that I typically like a mix of both. I want you to tell me that God has good things for me, and I want you to tell me that because of that, I'm supposed to fight for other people to have some good things for their life, right? I think that there's a balance, that part of the work of the church is about speaking to the souls of Black people, about recognizing that we are people with soul and with spirit, that we're not mere laborers, not for corporations, and also not for movements, right? And so we've got to be able to hold that position, and that's the thing. When in Eloquent Rage, I write a lot about growing up with my real dad was a violent abuser, and I talk about going to church and watching my mama cobble together between the Bible and Iyanla Van Zandt and Susan Taylor, because I was a kid in the 90s, right? And we couldn't afford therapy, right? But her cobbling together therapy for herself based on the preacher and those women, and they're very self-helping. We have all the critiques of that. But the way that my mama freed herself from the clutches of a set of cycles of abusive relationships was by reading people who said, you matter, you have dignity, you have worth, and you're worth fighting for, right? Now, what I didn't think is that structurally, it would have helped if preachers had said, brother, stop beating up on your wives on Saturday night and then come to church on Sunday morning, right? That was the piece that was missing. But the piece about speaking to her soul made a tangible material difference in my life and my life possibilities and how I understand relationships. So I don't want to reduce what the speaking to the soul and the spirit does for our people, right? What I want to say is that we need to do it with more responsibility, because for all the people who have been uplifted, It is that vulnerable space in which folks come into the church with soul and spirit open, needing to hear something, needing to be healed, needing to be seen, that we have then used as a source of violence against women, against gay people, against trans people, against poor people. The reason that folks are leaving the church is because they're mad at us, and they have the right to be, because we have been violent. And I feel like it is important to say, I am sorry for the violence the church has done. Not the white church, screw them. I'm sorry for the violence the black church has done. I'm sorry for the ways I was complicit with that violence when I didn't know any better. But I also know that and I want to make that apology because it's important, because people have actually been hurt by the things that we have said and the ways that we have shamed people and the ways that we have judged how people love and live in the church. And we have to own that if we're going to be a part of it. So that's important. But the other reason that you see church folks who know something is wrong with the message not reforming is because they are controlled by fear. There is a problem in the theology itself, because we grow up being told that if you challenge God too hard and you challenge the preacher too hard, that you are literally going to block your blessings. That you are literally opening yourself up to being outside of God's hedge of protection. And that is a horrible thing to do to black people, when that hedge of protection is sometimes the only thing we feel like keeps us between the clutches of capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy taking us out, is we like, but God's hedge of protection is around me, and it's some stuff you can't do to me. So then when you then go into a church and you ask people to wrestle with the Bible, you ask people to wrestle with what they see in the text, you don't give people any tools to be able to do that wrestling with any integrity, then you are literally trying to take away the foundation upon which people build their lives so that they can be woke, and not giving them anything to replace it. And I think that that's irresponsible. And so I try to be mindful when I'm asking people to upend their theology, to recognize that it is deeply fearful for them. That what if everything my mom and my grandmama taught me is untrue? That's what people are saying. You're telling me my whole way of thinking about the world is untrue. And some people don't have the luxury of going with you on that kind of intellectual journey because they're trying to make it. And so that is also the thing that we're losing in church. That's not me disrespecting people's capacity. It is me making a call for us to train ministers in such a way that they have the tools to go into churches and give people better frameworks to grapple. Right? Because my Sunday school teachers gave me great frameworks to grapple with the word. They did. But the other thing about the church is, because I keep thinking about I'm always like, well, when we ask people to have different language, well, where did we get the language? Because let me tell you what, I didn't get woke in my Baptist church in Ruston, Louisiana. I got woke when I went away to college. I got woke because I had the opportunity to do a PhD. That's the reason I know the word intersectionality. So where are our people getting access to the concepts? Where are they getting access to trust that, you can challenge biblical literalism and still Jesus won't hate you? And you're not unsaved and you're not blasphemous. Where are they getting it from? And who are the trustworthy people that are going to give them the tools and concepts? If we say that we're about a movement, we actually have to be committed to what the real actual work of training people looks like. But let me say this last thing. It is such an honor to sit on this panel with Dr. Obery Hendricks because, and I think I've tagged him in my telling of this story on Facebook. So in 2014, I had an opportunity to go to Ferguson as part of the Ferguson Black Lives Matters rides across the country. And Ferguson, my experience there in 2014 radically changed my own spirituality. First of all, I was on a bus for 20 hours with no outlets with a bunch of people that I didn't know that well. Because when people talk about movement work, that's what it was. It was trash. It was 20 hours of trash on a bus. Okay, anyway, let me leave it alone. But what I realized is that I was there with a bunch of young queer folks, and that many of them were ministers or deeply spiritual people. And I was like, because I am a church girl, I was like, oh, Holy Spirit, what is happening here? A special thing. I sense it. I don't know what it is, but that's interesting. Because it was all these crunk kids on a bus who were like, but you started talking to folks and you heard their narrative. So we get to Ferguson. We go to Reverend Starsky Wilson's church. He recently left the pastorate of St. John's UCC, but he pastored St. John's UCC. Now, the first radical thing he did was, we were there with all our fluffy woke stuff, so we were like, we need a room for Reiki and healing and scream therapy and tarot cards. And he was like, okay, we can give you a room for that. And I was like, what? What kind of, I was like, you know, and the Baptist in me was like, these UCC people, they really stepping, because ain't no Baptist gonna give you no room for nothing like that, right? So we're in the church, you know, we got our room over here, you can go get readings and stuff. We're in the basement organizing, and then Sunday comes and we're organizing, and so Reverend Wilson does Sunday service. The title of that sermon was based on Dr. Hendricks' book. It was called The Politics of Jesus. And he gave out copies of that book in the audience. And he preached one of the most radical messages I've ever heard. It was that perfect mix of the charisma and the you are seen with a sort of political mandate that we must fight. And I was shocked because I saw people were, before church, folks were scared to come up because we had so many queer folks organizing with us on the ground, trans folks who had shown up and who had stepped foot in the church after, y'all know what we do to queer and trans people, and they had the courage to step in the door to organize in the church, and they were like, we don't know if we're gonna go to service. And he said to them, you know, you don't have to come. You are welcome to use this basement, but we're gonna have church. You know, I feel like that's the best of both black worlds. We're gonna have church, but you are welcome to be here in whatever capacity you want to be. So they said, you know what, we're going to give this brother a shot. Think about what they're risking in giving him a shot.
Yeah, that's right.
Because he could have used that moment to abuse them again.
Yeah.
But they were the courageous ones. So they come through. He preaches his ass off, right? He does. He just preaches his face off. He just does. I don't scream and shout in church because I'm too dignified. And I was like, if he keeps on, I'm coming out of this pew. I'm gonna do it. But people started running down the aisles of that church. And I watched folks say, I haven't been in church in years and years because of the things the church had done to me. And it was a reminder that that is the best of the gospel. That it isn't about the building, that it was the whole weekend was the gospel. We were on a bus going to fight for people we didn't know because they asked us to come. So we showed up. It wasn't about trying to convert people. It wasn't about trying to save souls. It was about saying our people are in the clutches of the beast, and what we can do is show up and put our bodies on the line with them. And so we did that. That is church. That is gospel. And then when you get people in the door, show them that God loves them. Not you need to change. Not there's a whole bunch of stuff wrong with you, but just we see you. So I saw it, and it reminded me that this is what the church has the potential to be if we'll do it right. But that means that we've got to all. So it gave me a mandate. Part of what it taught me was that God cares about black lives. That it's okay to say that really forthrightly. And it taught me that is the core of what Jesus was fighting for, was for us to undo empire. And so all of the conversations that we have on any theological Sunday are about the radical potential of love to undo the ways the systems would oppress us and kill us. That is what the whole thing is about. And if that ain't what we're talking about, then we're not actually talking about the gospel, and we're not doing nothing in the tradition of Jesus. And relevant to today, we're not doing anything in the tradition of King either.
The doors of the church are open.
Yes, amen. So, this is a sister who claims she's not a theologian, but that is theology. You know, theology is not, speaking Christology and soteriology and all that stuff. I don't get into all that. I don't even read theology, to tell you the truth. I'm a biblical scholar. But there's just one thing I want to do. Well, a biblical scholar, what we do is you look at the text, you look at it in historical perspective, and contextualize it, and draw conclusions from there. We don't use a whole lot of words like in theology. So, but one thing that Dr. Cooper, a point that she made, I think is so important, and that is the point of balance. We need a balance. Now, Jesus said something that I understand as being the quintessential definition of holistic spirituality. He said, love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We have the vertical, we have the horizontal. You can't have a cross without both of them. And where they meet, that's holistic spirituality. And so we have to treat the people's pain and suffering. And, there was that play years ago, No Place to Be Somebody. The church is the only place a lot of folk can be somebody. Only place they can come and cry. Only place that a lot of elders get touched is in church, if they get touched at all. Get a help from the pastor. But at the same time, that we treat the symptom, we also have to treat the cause. And systemic cause of the suffering is overlooked. That's why King was so hard on capitalism, because it divided people. It was profits over people. It was just us over justice. It didn't value the integrity of people. It's not democratic. Whoever has the most money has the most votes. It's not one person want to vote. And so King talked about both things. But he, unlike so many preachers today, he had a holistic perspective and a holistic perspective in that he was talking about systems as well. And that is what we're not talking about. And the other thing you talk about, touching people emotionally, what bothers me sometimes is that these preachers, as you're saying, they appeal to emotion, but they're not looking to heal emotion. And that's so deeply sad. And then we have this bogus definition of spirituality that's really emotionality. So, people talking about he had the spirit. Well, yeah, but what spirit? But more than that, sometimes people come to church to have a cathartic experience because they've suffered so much during the week. And so folk will get up and cry, and they'll let it out. That's what's supposed to happen, part of what's supposed to happen, but that is not necessarily what we call spirituality. Spirituality has two prongs, and not only that. This thing about everything is anointed these days is just ridiculous in biblical terms. You can't have anointing all in the place. That's not what the Bible says. Now you can say that, but don't act like that's what the Bible says. And everybody's anointed, and if somebody gets all excited, all the anointing is on them. But we're not looking. We don't even have definitions of spirituality anymore. We don't have meditation in church anymore. We don't have quiet moments anymore. If there's a quiet moment, people get upset. It's like something's wrong. No, we don't talk about fasting anymore. We don't talk about solitude. We don't talk about spiritual ministration at all in the church. And that's, I think, the biggest disappointment for me, is that spirituality and striving become ever more God-centered, and God consciousness is not something that's really pushed. Being people who can hold to doctrine and orthodoxy better, those kinds of things. That's what people are being pushed toward. But becoming a really spiritual person. And this is my last statement in the Bible. 2 examples. Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to make me jump and shout and fall out." No, he didn't say that. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor." And what's good news to the poor is that the systems and the relationships and all those things that make and keep them poor, that they need to be transformed. And then when you have the day of Pentecost, 2nd chapter of Acts, when all of the followers of Jesus in this upper room, scared to death after Jesus has been tortured publicly and executed, they're frightened that they might be next. And in this upper room, they're frightened to death. And they're sitting there. They're unfocused on each other. It says that people couldn't understand each other's tongues, each other's interests, and all that. But then it says the Holy Spirit came down like tongues of fire, and it was at that point that the people became empowered. But even more importantly, what happened? The Holy Spirit came on them. They went out and ended up working to change the world. And so you can tell if a person really has the Holy Spirit, because it makes them want to do something, not necessarily try to become a Martin Luther King, but it will make them act differently. make them feel more lovingly, make them feel some responsibility, make them take seriously, love your neighbor as yourself. So those are the kinds of things, the kinds of questions we really have to ask, and that's not for every person in the pew to deal with, but those of us who claim to know a little something and to be leaders, we have to start talking about that. When I was president of a seminary, I made sure that all the students knew what ideological domination, hegemony was, so they could understand what was happening to them. I made sure they understand some political philosophy, those kinds of things. How's the world work? That we need to do that, and then we need to make sure that we hold preachers' feet to the fire in terms of education and training. And when someone says, well, touch not the head of my anointed, that wasn't talking about preachers, it's talking about David 3,000 years ago. But when people say, someone says that, we'll say, well, who's perfect? God is perfect. So that means we can question our pastors. Now, you're going to get in trouble if you do that. But, some of them stand up and say something ain't right in church. Well, God didn't make Adam and Steve. Made Adam and Eve. We got to stand and say, wait a minute. Now they're going to usher you out. But at least, and then other people say, well, maybe I can ask a question too. So all these things we have to do. Those of us who are really serious about it, we have to be radicals and revolutionaries in the church. Martin Luther King said, we need to know the difference between reform and revolution. And a lot of people don't know that Martin Luther King, but he said it and he believed it and he tried to practice it.
That's it. I want you to respond to this, and then we have time for a few questions. We're running a little bit behind, but after you respond, I want to get some. Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, this is good. This worked out just fine. So we got 2 questions in the audience. So after you speak, we'll do that, and then we'll jump to the next panel. But yes, please take your time too.
Okay. So I wanted to go back to what Dr. Cooper said about Ferguson, because I just remembered we were sitting together in church, right? And so I didn't ride the bus though. I flew. So I didn't have that experience, but I missed it. I missed having that experience. No? Okay. Well, I felt like I missed it, but because I think did the air go out? The air, and it was hot. But I wanted to go back to that because that weekend reminded me, that weekend had a high spirituality. We were there to do activism, but it was a spiritual move. And that reminded me of what Mama Ruby Sales, she always talks about what she feels like sometimes we are lacking in current social movement is the spirit. And she's very clear that the movement in the 1960s was a spiritual movement. And King says that this was a spiritual movement. It wasn't just about the idea of freedom. It was about the spirit of freedom. It was about the spirit of the people. It was about the spirit of something greater calling them to be greater. And that's what I experienced that weekend. And I think that that's a helpful theology for us to think about, because I think actually Pastor Starsky is a good example. He's in the King tradition, right? So it wasn't just his message. Friday night, when we got there, the first thing that before we went out into the streets and all of that, we were at church. And it wasn't necessarily a church service, but I've forgotten, now I'm raised in the church, but I had forgotten that we were in church, and I didn't even know that he was the pastor. So he definitely had this model, this kind of servant leadership. Not so much, I don't see King in this way. I definitely see King as Black Moses, Black Messiah. He's gonna be in the pulpit, you're gonna know, right? Like, even though we're all there in t-shirts, he's probably gonna be in his robe. Starsky was with us. So I didn't even know that he was the pastor until probably Sunday. I had missed that. And so there was this fierce activism, but this movement of beloved community that he had ushered into that place. Clearly that was the culture of the church, to truly live out this beloved community. And I think that if we want to think about a radical theology that is useful to today's time, I think it's important to go back to King's work and look at, even with all of his flaws, to look at what did he say say about beloved community? Even though he didn't always practice beloved community when it came to women in particular, but what did he say? He was leading us somewhere, right? So what did he say about beloved community? What did he say about love? And what did he say about justice? I think that those messages are still relevant. I want to leave us with this quote from him. Excuse me.
Don't leave us.
Okay, not leave us. But I want to end this. I want to end this point on this quote he has. Okay, he says, "Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love." And so I think that he gives us instruction in terms of how to live a life that is theologically. He talked a lot about kind of morality, right? So we have a whole lot of ideas about morality. But for King, it was not, believe it or not, it was not don't smoke, don't drink. He wasn't for all of that, right? Because he did all of that. He was very complex. But that morality was rooted in the sense of love that called us constantly to our higher self. And that higher self then in turn led us to live a life that was just, that was not egotistical, but it was just for all. And so we were not free. Just the statement that he makes, that we're not free until everyone is free, right? And so I think that's a theology to live by. Oftentimes we think of theology in terms of, what we can't do. And I think that we should be thinking about it in terms of what we can do and all the ways that we can love and what love looks like and how love in real life, in the world, it looks like a more just world. It looks like justice. It looks like me wanting the same things for me that I would want for, or the same things for my trans kin that I would want for myself, or that I would want for my son.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon. My name is Asantor Mpomo-Toure. Thank you to all the panelists. My question is, if I may go to another page, Mama Coretta Scott King. Can any of you comment on her public debate with her niece, Alveda King, regarding reproductive justice, and gay rights, etc.? Because I think a lot of people don't realize what Coretta was before she married Dr. King and after he was murdered, and the work that she was doing along the way. So thank you.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of having a long conversation with Mrs. Coretta King. To give you some idea what she was like, I finally got embarrassed that we were talking so long, so I broke the conversation off. That shows how humble she was. She was an activist before she met Lamont. In fact, as you know, she pushed him on the war question. Alveda King, I met her also, and to say I'm not impressed is an understatement. I mean, she walked into the room and said, "Hi, I'm Alveda King. I'm what's his brother's name? King's brother's name? Well, anyway, I'm his brother's daughter." I'm like, so what? I mean, but she plays off this being a king, being a member of the King family. It's not her fault because the church acts like they're royalty, and they're not. They should be respected, but they ain't, just because you part of the family. And she's doing the exact opposite of King. Alveda King is the worst kind of Negro, in my opinion, because she knows better. And she cleaves to Trump, and she's always cleaved to these right-wingers because there aren't too many Negroes who will bother with them. And so she's always around grinning. And in terms of her discussion with Miss Coretta King, I mean, really, it doesn't even deserve comment in a way, because she's so wrong. I mean, the Bible, abortion is a horrible thing, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that abortion is wrong. It talks about abortion 2 places. In Exodus 22, it says that if a man hits a woman who's pregnant and he hurts her, that's eye for an eye. But if he makes her lose the baby, then you have to pay a financial fine. In other words, it makes a distinction between someone already living and a fetus. And then the one other place, I forgot exactly where it is, but it talks about, it's in the Old Testament. It talks about God. It talks about aborting a child as a punishment. Now, all I'm saying is, you can't say that something's there that's not there. Killing people is bad, but don't say the Bible speaks about abortion against abortion. It doesn't. That's a moral question we grapple with. Jesus never mentions it. By the way, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality either, by the way. So anyway, it's those kinds of questions, and that's what's really bothersome. Alveda King, in so many ways, doesn't pay attention to the Bible. She pays attention to what those conservatives say. Miss Coretta King, Dr. King, they came, you could see them chapter and verse. One last thing, Matthew 25, 31 to 46 says, and it ends with, as you have not done to the least of these, you have not done it to me. But that is the primary, if not the only, but certainly the primary way that Jesus said you judge people. Whether you have fed, try to feed the hungry, shelter, or give clothing to the naked. It says, as you have done that, as you visited in prison, as you've done that to them, you've done it to me. As you have not done it to them, you have not done it to me, and off you go into hell. That is something we need to start pushing again. If we're to judge each other, it's about whether we're trying to make a just difference in the world. And it doesn't say who you're sleeping with. It doesn't say what your race is. It says, how do you treat people in the world? Jesus talked about how do you treat people, not what you believe. You can say you can believe anything, but how do you treat people? And that's how Alveda King falls short, and conservative theology falls short in every way. It's sad. I'm writing a book about it right now, and it's scary, man. It's really upsetting.
Can I make a really quick point?
Real quick point, then we're going to go to this last question.
Super quick. I'm not answering the question. I just want to say a quick thing about abortion, and that because I know that's because it was just named, and just as I'm a black feminist, and I just can't have us talking about abortion and then not address it. So it's very important that the black church take some time and deal with abortion, because part of why that small percentage of black men and some black women voted for 45 is on the issue of abortion. I preached a sermon this summer on abortion, and I talked about how the ancestors, the part of their radicalism was finding ways to abort those children that they didn't want. So we need to spend time and radicalize and get a feminist lens. We need some feminists talking about abortion and why women may want to choose that as their right in their body, because I think we have to be very careful about talking about abortion in terms of murder and murdering people.
Right.
I mean, I just think we just have to be very careful about that, because many people don't see it's fetus, right? So we have a different idea in terms of when life begins. So that's a whole different discussion. But I just wanted to say really quickly that I think the black church has to address this, black people, black communities, has to address kind of where they stand on this, but that we really have to broaden our ideas in terms of what abortion means and seeing it beyond it being this murder. Sometimes it's a sense of relief. Sometimes it's a sense of keeping your sanity. Sometimes it's a sense of protection. So it's a variety of reasons why people get abortions. But I think that that's a conversation for a later time that the black church definitely needs to address.
And just real quickly, you go through the history of Christendom, and different times, there's never been one definition of when a cell or fetus becomes a human being. There have been all kinds of different definitions throughout history. The Christianity has never settled on just one, and I won't go into any more of it, but it's a very complex issue that we have to deal with. And in terms of people getting, during the enslavement period, sometimes people aborted their children because they just couldn't see bringing them into such agony. So I'm not supporting it.
Abortion was a sign of love during slavery.
I'm not supporting it, saying because it's a terrible thing, but I would never tell a woman what she's supposed to do. I'm going to tell somebody what they're going to do with their body.
So here's the thing. What we need to do is we need to say that reproductive justice is a part of the kind of radical theology that we are trying to live. And reproductive justice, which is a framework developed by Black women, says that we all have the right to parent or not parent under the conditions of our choosing. And unfortunately, what the church does is they shame the way that people come to be parents, the way that people come to have families, and then we get stories about how the birth rate is not being replenished in the church. The Black church has been a part of shaming Black women. So look, I think abortion is a personal concern that you have to think about with your God, and I don't judge anybody about it, because here's the thing. But I don't want us to talk about that like we talk about, gay people, right? Where we say, well, we all sin. No. Consent is pivotal. And when you talk about the moment when Mary finds out she is pregnant with Jesus in the biblical narrative, there's a conversation about consent before the pregnancy happens. Her and the angel have a negotiation, and she says, "Be it unto me," right? There is an assent. Now, we can talk about power dynamics in that moment too, but at least we get a biblical narrative of assent before a baby is placed in her body. So even the Bible gives us a model for, so I would like to imagine a world in which Mary could have said, "No, I don't want this," and Jesus would have said, "Well, God would have said, let me pick somebody else then." So, but here's the other question, right? If you've ever talked to women who have abortions, they actually aren't, in my experience, parsing conversations about is it a human or is it not a human. They are asking questions about whether they have the capacity to parent. Right. And that is the conversation that we need to